Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast, episode 50. And in fact, this is the first episode under the new name, the VO2 Lounge Coaching Podcast. And this is because I've decided off the back of this podcast to start a cycling coaching business. If you would like to be coached by me, then feel free to email at the vo2lounge@gmail.com and we can have a call to discuss what your requirements are, which don't have to be you're trying to race. It can simply be either you just want to improve or you want to do some sportives, and we can work through making you the fittest, strongest version of yourself this year. So I've just come back from a cycling holiday / training camp in Girona, and as such I wanted to share some of my thoughts on planning a trip and also block periodization. Block periodization is the aim / purpose of this episode. However, I thought I'd include a little bit of waffle at the beginning of my episodes, make it a bit of a softer intro. I've thought a little bit for a while as to how I can add this in. I had some short episodes that I was doing in the past where I would talk specifically about my kind of training to date. However, I thought, to be honest, after listening to a couple of other podcasts, the thing I like the most is this softer introduction where you just get to know the host a little bit more, and it's a softer ramp into the what will become quite a technical discussion about, in this case, block periodization. So how's training going for me, and how was this trip away? Well, since my last update, which was actually quite some time ago, I believe, I've raced 3 crits, been on the week-long holiday / training camp, and had 1 road race. So the first 2 crits were part of a spring 3-4 crit series. If you're not from the UK, 3-4, 3rd and 4th cat. Here we have elite 1, 2 and 3 and 4. 4th cat, where you start. Once you get out of 4th cat by getting X number of points, you can't go back down to 4th. 3rd cat can sometimes have some real mystery riders who haven't been around for a little while, got knocked down a few pegs. So it can be a bit of a feisty ride. However, in this instance, the spring series is really good opening series, and there's 4 events around the same criterium circuit. Nice, easy round loop. There aren't even really technically any corners. There's no technical sections. Later in the year, they open it up a lot more. But for the purpose of this time of year, where here in the UK it can be pretty wet and miserable, the surface isn't always great, so I think for that reason, I think is why they keep it in the closer circuit. But I entered 2 of these because I was on a non-cycling related holiday for the first 2, unfortunately. You get around 40 riders in this event, and in these races I placed 17th and 18th. Average power was around 250 watts with a normalized power of 320 watts. I'm an 87 kilo rider, if that helps at all. The aim of these for me, as you can see really from the normalized power, is at this point of the season, it's basically a hit out, saving the legs and doing a really tactical race for the purpose of the sprint at the end. Not so much the goal. The main goal for me during these events is, 1, first of all, obviously do get used to being in the bunch again and just get that sort of bunch vision where you can see all the gaps opening up and you can move and slalom around within the group, not be nervous when you're so close to people at high speed. These races average about 40 to 42 k's an hour, so it's a good opportunity to get used to that again. But also, if it does come to a sprint, which there is a sprint, whether that is for the win or not, doesn't really matter. It's that final 2 lap positioning, that power profile for the final lap and positioning for the sprint, which first event, bit rusty, didn't get a good shot out for the sprint, and then the second one, much better positioning in the field sprint. But it was just a good hit out in general. And then they just gave me a good idea where the fitness was. Definitely okay, just needed sharpening up, the sort of aerobic, the ability to recover, because I did a few attacks after those and really go into the red and come back and surf the wheels and keep myself together, definitely there. So moving on from there, 40-20 efforts and 4-minute efforts started coming back in with sort of good weekly progression and signs of fatigue resistance coming through. Sort of the first 40-20 session was 8 reps or like 8 40-second on periods, 2 blocks, about a 10-minute break in between, and then the 4-minute efforts, 4x4, and then just bringing it out to 5, 6, 7, and the 40-20s now, this time of year, a few months down the line, now doing my last one, I did a block of 12 and a block of 10, and then try and move on to 2 blocks of 12. I've experimented before with 3 blocks of 10, so overall greater time, but experimenting with the stimulus and the fatigue that I feel like you get from the block of 12. But we'll continue with that and see how that all kind of goes. The power's trending the right way, and the number of intervals is trending the right way. Then we get to Girona, which happened after the first 2 crits. This ended up being about 20 to 22 hours a week. Could tot them all up exactly, but we're just in that rough area. Most of the volume from just zone 2, obviously noodling around, and then a few notable climbs between 30 minutes and an hour. So day 1, flew in, managed to check in, build the bikes, get out. We ended up cycling a little bit in the dark, but that was a 2-hour ride if you're from the area or been there. Went up the Hells Angels climb, 60k loop, great little start to it. Day 2, just typical 4-hour, 4.5-ish hour coastal ride. Day 3, essentially a 5-hour ride where we went to Mer du Delmont, which is a 20-kilometer, 18-kilometer climb. Finishes just over 1,000 meters. Went there the previous year, did about an hour and 14. Went there this year, did an hour and I think 6 minutes. Averaged about 260 watts. It was nothing crazy because obviously already ridden out there, already had 2 days in the legs, and had to get back. So it wasn't crazy. But definite, real good signs of progression. Similar-ish temperature, similar, same bike, heavier equipment because I had aerial wheels on, like 55 mils. And the heart rate was very similar, just it was about 15 to 20 watts-ish more power for the duration. Essentially, I just hammered the actual climb, the heavy bit of the climb, was very similar. My timings across there, most of the time was just gained on the flats, being able to just push a lot harder on the flat, which my pacing knowledge now coming from doing hour-long efforts earlier in the year definitely kind of transfer well across to this. Day 4, took a rest day, actually, and on day 3 started feeling the tingle in my throat that I get usually when I'm biting something usually. And I was like, this could go either way. Wake up on day 4, definitely ill. Day 5, really runny nose. But we go out for 3.5 hours, coastal route. Day 6, another 3-hour loop, however, up Roca Corba. That we hadn't done the previous year that we went. Previous year we only did 4 days, didn't do Roca Corba. The descent on that climb, if anyone's going there and thinking about doing it, is a little sketchy with all the there's loads of little gravelly bits and cracked pavement. And if people are coming up the other way, trying to dodge the cracked pavement, I mean, granted, if you got disc brakes or really carbon rim brakes like I have, you could go slower. I was pushing it on a little bit just because of what I feel comfortable with, but it just meant pushing the bike a little bit at times, braking in certain areas. But for the most part, I actually prefer the climb to Mer du Delmont. I actually think it's a nicer climb, and the lower slopes of it, great. I can see why people did intervals. And if you are a less experienced rider going there, who 100k ride in general is decent going, then Roca Corba is like 15k from Girona. It's so close that you can get there really quickly. We did a longer loop in the sense that we probably did, I don't know, 60k before we hit Rocacorba. So that's just how we did it. But it's a lot easier than trying to go over to Mer de Delmont, which is considerably further, considerably longer day, especially when you're climbing for an hour plus, or maybe you're really strong and you're doing a big effort and sub an hour. But for the most part, hour climb. And then day 6 finished off with a 4 and a bit maybe coastal ride. And so yeah, the head cold seemed to, the day 5, 6, day 5, we did a coastal route in the opposite direction and actually went up a climb that we went down that I really liked the look of, so wanted to go up it. And I still seem to have really strong legs. The head cold stayed as a head cold. A little bit of a chestiness, like coughing up some, whatever you want to call it, catarrh or whatever they call it. But for the most part, everything was still kind of good. I think probably I could have gone better, not knowing how much it was affecting me with recovery, but I managed to keep it under wraps and it didn't really get out of control. And to be honest, by day 6, no longer really needed tissues, and then by day 7, the flight home, completely fine. So bit of a shame that I got the cold, but it is what it is. Glad I kept it under wraps. Now, once I got back, which for reference, this is, let's just say broadly speaking, this was a double in volume. Up until this point, I'm probably doing 10 hours-ish a week, 7 to 10, maybe 11 at times, but mostly in that kind of region. So I doubled the volume for this. So advisably, usually after block periodization, you do take a bit of a sort of ease off the gas a bit. So I did take 3 days off. Obviously, one day's traveling day, the Wednesday, then took the Thursday and the Friday. However, on the Sunday, I had entered a 2-3-4 road race, which is a regional A. It's like a 100k race, and moderately rolly, I'd say. Had a bigger descent in it, and then you didn't really notice the climbing as much. It came off the back of some faster bits, some up and downs, and then there was one notable kicker a little bit before the finish. There was probably still another 100, 200 meters, maybe 300 meters before the finish after that point. A really fast race, 42k an hour, average power around the 230 mark, normalized 300 watts. So it was definitely the way the race panned out. Because it was fast, there was a couple of periods where people actually got off the front but then just got caught. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting too much from the race, because last year I entered a race and got dispatched after about 1.5 laps at a 2-3-4 race. And essentially that 1.5 lap power profile, incredibly similar to this race is power profile, where the first lap was like 280 watts, and then it just got progressively easier and easier and easier. Partially there, I learnt the course, I realized how fast everything was going, and rather than being a bit nervous at the beginning and ending up on the front for a little bit, sort of trying to get in a move as well, for some stupid reason, I ended up making it harder than it needed to be for myself. Yes, you don't always know that it's going to stay together, but really with where the corners were and so on, I could have just done what I did for the remainder of the laps, sat in a little bit more. Yes, the corners were hard to kind of really swim out wide because they had islands in the middle of them, so you really were, for the cornering, stuck to the single side of the road. It was quite awkward in that sense, because technically I often do is you come into this corner and they've closed the entries and exits to the corner, so you're now safe. Once you can really see the corner, you're safe to kind of push out to the other side, assuming it's a dashed white line. You can push out a little bit and you can come around the edge of the peloton, not sprint on the way out. But with these, there wasn't really a corner like that because they all had islands on them, and so you were forced to stay to that side of the road, and they made it clear in the race briefing that was the case. and they were pretty hot on it. So that couldn't be done. It wasn't even an advantage really to some extent. I suppose if you really pushed out and really cut the corner, it would be. But that was the big learning from there. One, it was great. I was actually quite pleased to have, it was a ferocious race, 17th in it in the end. Full race, so like 80 riders. And I was pretty chuffed overall with my performance, given the point in the year. And I just tend to build really well throughout the year. It's somewhat the story of me in racing to date. So year one of just cycling in general, coming back from like team sports to road riding. I hadn't done road riding before, rode mountain bikes before that a little bit, but first endurance sport really. Year one, just getting to the point where you could do a 4-hour ride without capitulating. And then year two, solid rider at sort of sportives, getting actually third fastest time overall at a local-ish, pretty hilly sportive, good power numbers for that. Doing at the time, which was pretty good, was like 230 watts for, I think, 5.5 hours. So solid numbers. But then at the end of the year, going to a 3-4 race, that was only a 60k race, and that I did the following year, getting spat after about a lap and a half. Then year three, solid block of time off. I ended up working somewhere with a long commute, didn't ride through the winter, probably did my last ride in like, really from June. I didn't even ride very consistently, and then definitely from November time. That was it. Off the gas completely. Solid block of time off, like after that sort of road race era. Sort of come back though, return to racing, get my Cat 3 license, have a good results in the Cat 4s, which was like a 2 seconds and a fifth, sort of press on to get some top 10s and top 20s in 3-4 races. But then get spat, as I said before, in a 2-3-4. And then year 4 so far, held together for the 2-3-4. The start of the crit season, we've only had one summer crit, and that was, I think, 11th place. So we're, all is trending well. Problem is with this sport is it's such a long build phase, really, I suppose, for the people who aren't coming in naturally gifted from some other sport. It just slowly compounds over time. The more hours you can do, the better. The more high intensity you get in and structured work you get in, the better. But it's not something that, obviously in the initial phase, like lifting weights, you will get this huge boost. But then you start to slow down and it becomes sort of incremental step changes in your performance. But the plan for this year would be to get the Cat 2 license. So I'm going to need to up my game a little bit in the crits and some tactical decisions. Power's probably there. The 2-3-4 races, in a weird way, they are training stimuluses. They're probably the level, depending on who's there and how it plays out, is probably a bit too high. But there's still definitely the opportunity to get in the sort of points region, the top 15, top 10. But they are, in a way, I wouldn't set one as an A race because the level's probably just a little bit, for the most part, too high. But anyway, that's enough of my waffle. Let's get into the actual main topic of the episode, and that's block periodization. So what is block periodization? Well, traditional periodization, with its division of the seasonal program into smaller periods and training cycles, was once the outright dominant approach. However, as sports evolved and athletes' demands increased, it became evident that traditional periodization had limitations, or was deemed to have limitations. These limitations included difficulties in achieving multiple peak performances, drawbacks of long-lasting mixed training programs, negative interactions of non-compatible workloads, and insufficient stimuli for highly qualified athletes. Now, although, block periodization is definitely an elite or an advanced training measure and really does need a lot of consideration taken in when doing it. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone who has a sporadic / inconsistently time crunched lifestyle can't use it in a manner at which they find that once every 6 weeks or once every 4 or however it is, whether you can squeeze in 1 or 2 weeks of higher volume, whether that's higher volume through intensity or just time in the saddle, this could still be something that is incredibly useful for those individuals. So in response to these challenges, coaches and researchers developed block periodization. This approach emphasizes the use of specialized mesocycle blocks where training focuses on a minimal number of motor and technical abilities in a concentrated manner, unlike traditional periodization, which aims to develop many abilities simultaneously. Block periodization advocates for consecutive training stimulation of carefully selected fitness components. One key aspect of block periodization is the rational sequencing of specialized mesocycle blocks, which involves exploiting and superimposing residual training effects. This means that different types of mesocycle blocks are used to target various modes and biological adaptations, such as homeostatic regulation or general adaptation mechanisms. Overall, block periodization represents a sort of reformed training approach that addresses the thought of shortcomings of traditional periodization and is designed to better meet needs of the sort of contemporary top-level athletes. I don't know whether you class to some extent altitude training really as block periodization. The fact that these elites in cycling specifically go on camps, that is really a form of block periodization, where you could argue these people need such a stimulus that they can't necessarily do that volume all year round. So they do a high amount, say 20 hours, then go on a camp, do 30 or 40, or go to altitude or so on to achieve that peak level of fitness that they maybe couldn't obtain through sea level training or through regular consistent, say 30 or 40 hour weeks, because they just can't handle it, for example. So for a more specific look on it, we can look at a paper titled, which is actually a meta-analysis titled Block Periodization of Endurance Training, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. The study compared block periodization and traditional periodization, so BP and TRAD is how they anachronized it, across various aspects of athletic performance, and it found that block periodization showed a small but statistically significant advantage over traditional methods in improving overall VO2 max. The maximum rate of oxygen consumption during intense exercise is what VO2 max is. I've had loads of episodes before I've mentioned it. I've even had episodes specifically on how to increase it and what it is and so on and so forth. So feel free to peruse through those previous episodes. Now, this suggests that block periodization may be more effective in enhancing aerobic capacity compared to traditional methods. Similarly, maximal power output, so Wmax, reflecting the maximum amount of work an athlete can produce, also favored block periodization again over traditional methods, reflecting the maximum amount of work, indicating that block periodization again might lead to greater improvements in maximal power output. However, when it came to endurance performance, because there was actually quite a lot of papers that were talking about was strength specific, so doing this massive overload period in strength sports, and you can kind of see obviously VO2 max and sort of a maximal power. These are two, obviously these are high-end values that you can't really do for extended periods of time. However, when it came to endurance performance, the findings were a bit more mixed. While some studies reported improvements in mean power output during cycling performance with block periodization, others found enhancements in time trial performance. Notably, not all differences between block periodization and traditional endurance performance were statistically significant, indicating like variability in effectiveness depending on the specific endurance task and individual athlete characteristics. So let's look a little deeper into findings and implementations of the study on block periodization compared to traditional periodization in endurance performance training. So maximal oxygen uptake and maximal power output were found. So the meta-analysis indicated that block periodization led to statistically significant improvements in VO2 max and W max compared to traditional, as we've already said. Despite the small effect size, even modest enhancement in VO2 max can have significant implications for endurance athletes, and these parameters directly impact aerobic capacity and overall performance potential. You think how much your FTP probably does change with a small amount in VO2 max, because that VO2 max in at least absolute form is divided over your weight, so it can have a large impact. Now, endurance performance, while regarding endurance performance were mixed, only one study showing significant improvements after block periodization, the overall trend suggested that BP tended to improve endurance performance rather than impair it. So again, a lot of studies, you end up coming to the end of these and going, okay, it's kind of just told me what not to do. And the fact that really traditional and block have both, it's suggesting it doesn't impair it, but it could mean that block periodization has a greater potential for you to get it wrong, really, because it's this one massive overload that you need to plan well and think about and recover from, versus just every week progressive overload through just a little bit more stimuli, doing 2 interval sessions a week, and then having a rest week when you feel like you're just maybe a bit flat, need a bit of a rest. And really, it just suggests that endurance performance, more work needs to be done, as they always say. Now, workload at different exercise thresholds, improvements in workload at different thresholds were observed in both block periodization and traditional, with some studies indicating larger improvements again with BP, and again suggesting, the higher end performance of this. The exact mechanisms underlying these improvements and their implications for overall endurance performance, again, require further investigation. So, in summary, while the study provides insights, pretty valuable insights, the potential advantages of block periodization over traditional endurance performance training, again, further research needed. But what is worth noting is a lot of these studies on block periodization is really always volume. I think there are less on volume from a hour's time perspective. And when it comes to these, it's an increase in the number of high intensity efforts. So if we look at a study titled Effects on 12 weeks of block periodization on performance and performance indices in well-trained cyclists, we're going to get a better understanding of how it's structured in general, how it's executed, and then what the results are from this specific study, with some numbers involved in throwing in there. So the study aimed to compare the effects of 2 different methods of organizing endurance training in trained cyclists over a 12-week preparation period. One group followed block periodization, where every 4th week consisted of 5 sessions of high intensity aerobic training, HIIT, followed by 3 weeks of 1 HIIT session. The other group followed a more traditional organization with 12 weeks of 2 weekly HIIT sessions interspersed with low intensity training, resulting in a similar total volume of both HIIT and low intensity between the 2 groups. The results indicated that block periodization led to a larger relative improvement in maximal oxygen uptake compared to the traditional group, 8.8% increase versus 3.7% respectively, which is such a big number that it's pretty uncanny to some extent. Like, it's the difference. it's a huge number. And from a study like that, you would be thinking now, why the hell am I doing regular periodization? Now, additionally, there was a tendency towards a greater increase in power output at 2 millimole, which is LT1, or like zone 2 essentially, or the top end of zone 2, in the block periodization group compared to the traditional group, which was 22% versus 10%. Like, imagine someone said you're going to do this block periodization and see a 22% increase in your LT1. Like, that is huge. Again, say mine's 260 or something, say mine's 250, and I do 10%, 25 watts, so 270 something, right? Versus another 10% on top of that puts me at like 290. It's huge, really. Now, to be fair, endurance protocol that gives you a 10% bump, real good work. But this is suggesting double that from that group. Now, the mean effect size of the relative improvement in the VO2 max power output at 2 millimole and hemoglobin mass and mean power output during a 40-minute all-out time trial now revealed moderate superior effects of the block periodization over traditional. And in summary, the study suggests that block periodization is the thing to do. And so let's take a bit of a better look really through the study. As already mentioned, the study aimed to investigate the effects of two different methods of organizing endurance training on training cyclists over a 12-week period: block periodization, traditional. And this is essentially the sort of overview. So the structure: the block periodization group involved 1 week block of 5 high-intensity aerobic training sessions, followed by 3 weeks of 1 HIIT session per week, along with a focus on high volume of low-intensity training. This 4-week training period was repeated 3 times. The traditional group included 2 HIIT sessions per week through the 12-week period, interspersed with a relatively high volume of low intensity. So the only difference here is that one is focusing on high intensity for 1 week, where they have extremely high intensity, 1 every 3, I believe. And then they're just doing 1, almost like a top-up session. It's almost like you're acknowledging that the stimulus required to gain versus the stimulus required to maintain are completely different. And almost what's coming across here is that the traditional group, there's just about enough stimulus. It's almost like the minimum effective dose to gain those benefits, and is what makes it lower risk and more steady and a better overall progression. It's kind of like let's not call it a crash diet, but it's almost like aggressive dieting versus long-term dieting, where one person may lose a kilo in 2 weeks, the other person loses a kilo over like 5 weeks. The person doing it over 5 weeks probably doesn't feel that hungry, is going to get to that 1 kilo weight loss, and the rebound chances are low. Whereas the person who gets there in the 2-week period feels really hungry the whole time, hits that number, and the rebound is quite likely, in all honesty. And so with this, it's essentially that you're dumping all this stimulus for the body to react. But to get you just have to you have to tiptoe around the edges to make sure that you don't bite off more than you can chew, and you don't put yourself in a hole. Now, I've thought about doing this in a way where, say I have a 2-3-4 race or a 3-4 race, a road race in like 3 weeks' time. But this week, I've got 2 crits. Like I've got a Thursday crit and I've got a Saturday or a Sunday crit. Well, in reality, I could do a Monday intensity, so that's 1 session, the Thursday and the Sunday, let's say it is, or the Thursday and the Saturday, and so that's now brought me up to 3. So now I only need to chuck in 2 additional intensity sessions. So I could chuck 1 intensity session after 1 crit, the secondary crit, and the other intensity session the day before. So you end up with a Monday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, a Saturday, and a Sunday. So a lot of volume. And the part of doing the crit is that I'm probably just going to get such a big stimulus and so much time at like sort of threshold heart rate that it's its own kind of form of threshold training. And then the others can be much more targeted. Maybe one's a 40-20 and the other two are like 4-minute VO2 max-esque efforts at like 115% of VO2 max. By the way, that is just like a random finger in the air thing of like thinking on my feet now how I could personally try and dump all that in. And then the week after, because there's always a crit, I'd just do that one singular interval session, which would be the crit. And then the week after, yes, technically I'd have two because I'd have the crit and the road race. But, you know, it's just a bit different. That week there is almost the recovery week. Come into the second week, again, I could just have the one crit session and say, again, the weekend after is the road race. Then you'd have the 2 weeks of easier intensity into that third week. And so it's something I could experiment with. It just needs a week where you've got 2 crits, essentially, to get that overload. But it is an idea. And now I've got myself thinking, so after this podcast, I'm going to open up my own little training calendar and shimmy things around and see if I can do that. But anyway, back on track. Training volume and training intensity. Both groups performed a similar volume of both HIIT and low intensity during the 12-week intervention period, with the number of HIIT sessions based on previous research suggested an average of 2 HIIT sessions per week for well-trained endurance athletes. Training volume and intensity were calculated based on heart rate zones, distributions with low intensity primary consisting of cycling and some cross-country skiing. The cyclists were instructed to perform low intensity sessions for a minimum duration of 1 hour at an intensity corresponding to heart rate zone 1. Performance measures physical tests were conducted before and after the intervention period to assess various performance parameters, including VO2 max, power output at lactate threshold, hemoglobin mass, mean power output during 40-minute all-out time trial, and other methods. Both BP and TRAD, so block periodization, traditional group, demonstrated improvements in performance measures, but block periodization tended to yield larger improvements, particularly in VO2 max, power output, and hemoglobin mass. It's all quite interesting. And to be fair, the reason I brought up this whole block periodization was I was going through the Matchbox podcast and Bonk Bros, obviously the same hosts on both, and they spoke about these block weeks, but also spoke about them as being very infrequent, whereas this is putting it forward as actually a moderately frequent mechanism. But I don't think you're going through it to the extent that they are discussing in there, where if you're a 10-hour-a-week athlete and you jump to 20 for 1 week, I think the impact on the body is not as bad as a 20-hour-a-week athlete jumping to 40, because a bit like the same that when you have a 450 watt FTP, you don't go riding your zone 2 rides at zone 2, because just physiologically and metabolically, you're still a human, and that is an incredibly large amount of power to go through the body, and it's sapping. Yes, you can race at it. Yes, you can do it for an hour, but the volume turns into more zone 1. Whereas when you've got a 300 watt FTP, you can go ride around at zone 2 all the time, because at the end of the day, it's only 220 watts, not like 330 watts. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that especially in this sort of high intensity distribution idea, it is probably something you can squeeze in however many times we've done here, 3 times in a 12-week period. If you actually get the paper up, there's a nice table 2 is a nice sort of interpretation of it, where you can clearly see the 3 different zones, and then how 3 times in the 12-week period, so week 1, week 5 and week 9, suddenly the zone 3 contribution, so the high intensity, is now this humongous contribution of the total volume, where it's like it's in the 50% region in the first week, and then it dies down a little bit, and zone 2 is also pretty substantial, and then zone 1, heart rate zone wise, is non-existent, but then in the other weeks it is the predominant factor, and zone 3 and zone 2 just non-existent. And definitely that zone 2 zone a lot of that you could say would come from like a race. Like if you're doing a crit, you'd spend a lot of time in that sort of middle zone of the 3. And then obviously the zone 1, a lot of that comes from just pootling about. And the zone 3, really that sort of stimulus comes from structured intervals, because in a race, if you're hitting that kind of effort, you're probably cooking yourself off. You won't be able to stay in the race. They also spoke about impact on well-being and fatigue. The cyclists' perceived feelings of well-being in their legs indicated that fatigue was accumulated during the hit blocks in the block periodization group, while the traditional groups reported normal legs throughout the training period, which again could be argued as a reason towards the traditional group, in the sense that clearly block periodization is going to be a taxing endeavor, and you really need to hone in that skill quite well. Now it suggests that the cumulative fatigue experienced during the hit blocks may have contributed to period adaptations. I've kind of tried for a while to make this link between cycling and the gym, in the sense that I go in the gym, and really, as my anecdotal bit of information, it's like if at one point in my life, I was like, oh, maybe I'm no longer getting DOMs because I'm just used to this or whatever. But nowadays I go through it of like, okay, if there is no muscle soreness, then clearly I haven't taxed the muscle enough. And I find that the two sessions a week, sometimes, just because I can't go deep enough in each session, I feel like it's not there. Now, whether that's a positive or negative, I don't know. But I wonder if then for someone like myself who maybe doesn't get that stimulus off the one session, again, these are completely different activities, but maybe this, as they're saying, this increased heightened sense of fatigue in the legs could be pointing towards these improved gains that they are witnessing. Now, the mechanism of action, again, study proposed that several potential mechanisms underline the superior effectiveness of block periodization, including the larger and more concentrated hit stimulus, inducing favorable adaptations in the mitochondrial biogenesis and capillarization of the skeletal muscle, additional alterations in training patterns such as distribution between hit and low intensity were hypothesized to influence hormone secretion and intercellular signaling cascades, ultimately impacting physiological adaptations and performance outcomes. But in summary, the study highlights the importance of strategic training organization, such as block periodization, in optimizing endurance training adaptations and performance outcome in trained cyclists. By simply manipulating training variables such as volume, intensity, and distribution, coaches and athletes can tailor training programs to maximize physiological adaptations, as we all really know by now. So let's look a little deeper into the key findings and their implications from the study comparing block periodization and traditional organization of endurance training in trained cyclists. So superior improvements in VO2 and power output. This I've already mentioned, but we'll go over it again. And then there's some more information on things like impact on hemoglobin mass, performance improvement across the 40-minute all-out time trial and WMAX, mechanisms behind it, and implications for endurance training. So the superior VO2 max, so the BP group showed a larger relative increase in maximal oxygen consumption compared to the traditional group. This is obviously a crucial measure for aerobic endurance and indicates the body's ability to utilize oxygen, Block periodization tended to lead to a larger increase in power output, again at 2 millimole. All stuff we covered already. But the hemoglobin mass, which plays a crucial role in oxygen transport to muscles, showed a moderate positive effect with block periodization compared to traditional training. This suggests that, again, block periodization may promote erythropoiesis, which is a production of red blood cells, to a greater extent than the regular training methods, potentially enhancing, again, the oxygen delivery to working muscles and improving endurance performance. The observed increase in hemoglobin mass with block periodization, despite similar training volumes and intensities as traditional training, highlights the effectiveness of block periodization model in stimulating physiological adaptations conducive to endurance performance. One thing I do want to kind of see if I can, in future episodes, get out from some studies, and maybe I'll just have to... It's hard to scan elites because they clearly are elite, so there is an element of bias from the standpoint of genetics. What I think would be really interesting to see, especially latecomers to the sport, or latecomers particularly to the professional scene, whether there are people who can help identify how crucial volume is to all this equation. And whether, they had all the training right, but were doing 10 hours a week and had, say, an FTP of like 360 after being training for 5 years, but then increased to, say, 20 hours a week or 25, and then you saw in the space of a year a huge jump, say, by 40 or 50 watts. Whether there's a way of identifying this, because it's all well and good, all these different types of periodization and so on and so forth, but it may be that this is just a too small a cog to really make a huge difference. But alas, we continue. Performance improvements in the 40-minute all-out effort. Both groups, again, demonstrated improvements in performance measures as mean power output during the 40-minute all-out time trial and peak aerobic power. However, again, the block periodization tended to lead to larger improvements in these parameters compared to traditional training. The mechanisms thought to be behind this, the study put forward several mechanisms underlying the superior effectiveness of block periodization. These include the larger and more concentrated hit stimulus, again, which results in the favorable stimuli, and additionally the cumulative fatigue experience during the hit blocks in the group may point towards this. Now, we've come to the end of this episode on block periodization. What do I think? I think it's something that definitely, for me, with my current time constraints on how many hours that I do ride, it'd be interesting to see if I have technically done one block of block periodization because of the trip to Girona. It just happened to be. One, it was pleasure, but also there was an element of me that was like the timing in the year meant it could really serve as a training stimulus. Have I seen the benefits? Well, we're quite close to when it happened. And so would I expect from that one thing to see a big boost? Not a massive boost, no. Have I seen some gains? I'd say definitely just the steady state capabilities seem to be, again, improved. But I think it's something that maybe we'll see maybe in a week or two where it starts to come to the top, and whether it's worth doing this block periodization attempt with high intensity and see if that yields anything. And so I think if it works within the calendar and everything aligns, possibly rather than just doing a Monday to Sunday, doing maybe a Sunday to Sunday, because I'll have a road race on the Sunday. I can take a day off after that. I can have a zone 2 ride, a crit, a high intensity ride, another crit and another high intensity ride, or in fact a day off, a high intensity ride, a crit, day off, crit, high intensity ride, and really see if that pushes the needle at all. But essentially, in summary, this study and the previous study put forward the concept that this block periodization could be a really favourable methodology for pushing your training forward. I do think there's greater risks involved, greater chance of digging yourself a hole, greater chance for fatigue. But does that mean there's a greater chance for reward? I don't know. But what's your takeaway from this? Feel free to email at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or jump on the Discord server that I've linked down below to leave feedback on this episode, and just comment in general as to whether you think block periodization works, whether you've tried it, what do you think of it. Feel free to leave your feedback. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts and suggest future topics at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or in the VO2 Lounge Discord server, as I've already mentioned, linked below. And for any training questions, again, the vo2lounge@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, it's goodbye.